This is a read aloud of The Circuit by Francisco Jimenez. So, normally I would be doing a lesson, or Mrs. Spencer or Mrs. Hayes would be up in front of you, and we would be doing a read aloud. And this would be one of the books that we would choose to do for your read aloud in working with you on fictional elements and everything that I kind of talked to you about in the video yesterday. So, with this distance learning, I am going to, or have decided to, read aloud this story to you through technology and try to go over some of the major concepts that you need to know. So, the story, The Circuit, is what it is a short story in the larger book, The Circuit, of a family who is a migrant family. They're migrant farm workers, and what that means is that they move from place to place wherever the crops are being needing ready to be picked. They would move to those crops and they would spend time on the farm and they would pick the crops. And then as the seasons change and new crops come in, they would move to the next place and pick the crops there. And so you're going to see from this story, you're going to make some connections from, this is a Mexican family. So you're going to see some connections there from your debate, your argumentative essay that you wrote, and your topic of Mexico in Mrs. Fritz's and Mrs. Berchtold's classes. The Circuit. It was that time of year again. Ito, the strawberry sharecropper, did not smile. It was natural. The peak of the strawberry season was over, and the last few days the workers, most of them braceros, were not picking as many boxes as they had during the months of June and July. As the last days of August disappeared, so did the number of braceros. Sunday, only one, the best picker, came to work. I liked him. Sometimes we talked during our half-hour lunch break. That is how I found out he was from Jalisco, the same state in Mexico my family was from. That Sunday was the last time I saw him. When the sun had tired and sunk behind the mountains, Ito signaled us that it was time to go home. Ya es hora, he yelled in his broken Spanish. Those were the words I waited for 12 hours a day, every day, 7 days a week after week. And the thought of not hearing them again saddened me. So I'm going to break because this is what we do in the classroom, and so I'm going to continue to use that process with you at home and talk to you a little bit about the beginning of this story. So first of all, I put a map up of Jalisco in Mexico, where they're from, so that you could see, since you studied Mexico, exactly where that is on the map. And I defined the term braceros because that is a Mexican term that's Spanish. And so you may not know that term, but it is a Mexican laborer who's allowed to work in the U.S. for a limited time in agriculture. And so also something that I thought would be important for you to realize is that we have a first person point of view. So we have a narrator, and we don't know who that narrator is right now. We do know that the narrator is going to be important because he is telling the story. So the characters so far, if we talk about the major fictional elements that we went over in yesterday's video, the characters so far are Ito, the sharecropper, which we don't know much about, and the narrator, who we really don't know much about either. But we do know that both the narrator and the person, the hard worker, are from Mexico, so we know the family is from Mexico, and that they are all working at this farm. So there are workers that work very long days. Now you may ask yourself, how do you know that they work long days? But this is where evidence from the text is so important, because they talk about the sun setting, and so you recognize that if the sun is setting, they must have been working all of that time, and they don't get to go home until the light is gone from the fields. Something else that's important is the setting of the story. And so we know that the setting is in August because it states that in the story, and we also know that August is in the summer, and we know that it's the end of summer. Other than that, we don't know where we are. We don't know what, place we are in, but we do know that it is a place where strawberries have grown, and it is the end of the strawberry season. So we're going to read on and we're going to hope to develop both our characters and our setting further. As we drove home, Papa did not say a word. With both hands on the wheel, he stared at the dirt road. My older brother Roberto was also silent. He leaned his head back and closed his eyes. Once in a while, he cleared from his throat the dust that blew in from outside. Yes, it was that time of year. When I opened the front door to the shack, I stopped. Everything we owned was neatly packed in cardboard boxes. Suddenly, I felt even more the weight of hours, days, weeks, and months of work. I sat down on a box. The thought of having to move to Fresno and knowing what was in store for me there brought tears to my eyes. That night, I could not sleep. I lay in bed thinking about how much I hated this move. A little before 5 o'clock in the morning, Papa woke everyone up. A few minutes later, the yelling and screaming of my little brothers and sister, for whom the move was a great adventure, broke the silence of dawn. Shortly, the barking of the dogs accompanied them. While we packed the breakfast dishes, Papa went outside to start the Carcachita. That was the name Papa gave his old black Plymouth. He bought it in a used car lot in Santa Rosa. Papa was very proud of his little jalopy. He had a right to be proud of it. He spent a lot of time looking at other cars before buying this one. When he finally chose the Carcachita, he checked it thoroughly before driving it out of the car lot. He examined every inch of the car. He listened to the motor, tilting his head from side to side like a parrot, trying to detect any noises that spelled car trouble. After being satisfied with the looks and sounds of the car, Papa then insisted on knowing who the original owner was. He never did find out from the car salesman, but he bought the car anyway. Papa figured the original owner must have been an important man, because behind the rear seat of the car, he found a blue necktie. Papa parked the car out in front and left the motor running. "Listo!" he yelled. Without saying a word, Roberto and I began to carry the boxes out to the car. Roberto carried the 2 big boxes, and I carried the 2 smaller ones. Papa then threw the mattress on top of the car roof and tied it with ropes to the front and rear bumpers. I'm cutting in with the plot diagram again because you were given this yesterday, and I want to make sure you have an understanding of what it is that your ultimate goal anyway, one of your goals, is to complete this for your book club book. So I just wanted to point out to you that is what we are trying to do today, is to give you some background on these fictional elements to make sure that you're successful with that. So again, I put up a word from the chapter that you may not have been familiar with, and that is jalopy. That's an old car that is not in good condition. So he bought his old car, the father, and he calls it the Carcachita, which is kind of a fun word to say. And so one of the things I want you to understand as you are reading through this story and as you're reading your own book is that characters develop over time. And so that happens based on a few things. And those are interactions that the character has with other characters, the behaviors of the character, the dialogue. So we learn about the characters through the dialogue. And so one of the things I want you to do is be a real critical reader and think about what is happening in the story and what is going on with the characters so that you can better have an understanding for what they are about, both their physical traits, but their character traits as well, which we've talked a lot about this year. So as we continue through, we're learning a little bit more about the narrator, and we know that, first of all, he is not looking forward to this move, and he actually stated that in the text, that he hates the move, the thought of it. He came home, and those boxes were there, and he recognized that and knew that that was not going to be a good thing for him. And it brought tears to his eyes, right? So we know that it makes him very sad. And that's really, again, all we know right now. We do know that he has a father, Papa. And when I talk about character development, think about the things that Papa did. He, when they left the field, drove quietly, right? Stared out the window. He examined the car very carefully. So when he went to buy it, he didn't just go into the lot and look at the cars and say, hey, this one looks kind of nice. I think I might get this. He actually went through and they even used a simile or a metaphor and basically compared him. It was a simile, and compared him to kind of like a parrot. Let me find that in He examined every inch of the car and tilting his head from side to side like a parrot. So we have a simile in there about how he examined the car. And then we know that he doesn't speak English, right? He hasn't spoken English. So how could we describe Papa based on his actions and words thus far? What do we know about that character? So those are the things that you have to be thinking about in your own book, right? Don't just, try to dig in and really look at the behaviors of the characters and what they do to try to help to bring out those character traits, right? He also has a brother named Roberto. And it's like, what does Roberto do? Well, he was quiet in the car, right? Like Papa. So maybe an older brother that's trying to be like the dad, right? Carrying the big boxes out. What about that part? When it came time to take the boxes out, the father pulls up in his car, and all he has to do is pull up and yell out, Listo, and the boys come out with these boxes. So, what does that tell you about the characters of Roberto and the narrator, right? They listen to their dad, they follow what he is telling them to do. They seem to be pretty respectful of the father if the father just pulls up and they know they better get those boxes out there. So those are things that, as we move on with the story, to help you to understand a little bit more about the characters. Something I thought was really interesting about Papa is that he thought the previous owner of the car was important because he found a tie in the car. And I put that in a big cloud on the right side because what do we know about Papa's character that he would see a tie in the car and automatically assume that that person must have been a very important person. So I want you to think about that. Think about that. Okay, I just pulled that out because I thought that was very interesting about Papa. A little more about his character. Now, the setting, we know so far they are at a strawberry farm, right? In late August, the family is moving to Fresno. Okay, so they're moving to Fresno. Their boxes are packed. We don't know where Fresno is. I don't know. I looked it up, right? Unless you didn't know, Fresno is in California. And also, they bought the car in Santa Rosa. So just by, looking at those two cities, we can say, hey, they were in California. That's where they were at. And that's where they're living at this time. Okay. And we also want to point out that they lived in a shack, which is not even a house. A shack is pretty, it's a pretty dilapidated, kind of place to live. So that's something to think about in terms of the setting as well. Everything was packed except Mama's pot. It was an old, large, galvanized pot she had picked up at an army surplus store in Santa Maria. The pot had many dents and nicks, and the more dents and nicks it acquired, the more Mama liked it. Mi olla, she used to say proudly. I held the front door open as Mama carefully carried out her pot by both handles, making sure not to spill the cooked beans. When she got to the car, Papa reached out to help her with it. Roberto opened the rear car door, and Papa gently placed it on the floor behind the front seat. All of us then climbed in. Papa sighed, wiped the sweat from his forehead with his sleeve, and said wearily, Es todo. As we drove away, I felt a lump in my throat. I turned around and looked at our little shack for the last time. At sunset, we drove into a labor camp near Fresno. Since Papa did not speak English, Mama asked the camp foreman if he needed any more workers. We don't need no more, said the foreman, scratching his head. Check with Sullivan down the road. Can't miss him. He lives in a big white house with a fence around it. When we got there, Mama walked up to the house. She went through a white gate, past a row of rose bushes, up the stairs to the house. She rang the doorbell. The porch light went on and a tall, husky man came out. They exchanged a few words. After the man went in, Mama clasped her hands and hurried back to the car. We have work! Mr. Sullivan said we can stay there the whole season, she said, gasping and pointing to an old garage near the stables. The garage was worn out by the years. It had no windows. The walls, eaten by termites, strained to support the roof full of holes. The dirt floor, populated by earthworms, looked like a gray road map. That night, by the light of a kerosene lamp, we unpacked and cleaned our new home. Roberto swept away the loose dirt, leaving the hard ground. Papa plugged the holes in the walls with old newspapers and tin can tops. Mama fed my little brothers and sister. Papa and Roberto then brought in the mattress and placed it on the far corner of the garage. Mama, you and the little ones sleep on the mattress. Roberto, Panchito, and I will sleep outside. Going back to the development of the characters, so we're really stressing characters here. And if you look to the top right corner, you're going to see how what I talked to you about before is how we learn more about the characters through the plot, through their actions, through their interactions with others, through their dialogue, how characters change. And we talked about this in Seed Folks, we talked about this in Bridge Home, the change of characters. I mentioned it yesterday. So as you are learning about your characters in your novels, you need to be thinking about these things. How is my character changing over time based on those particular interactions and their actions and their dialogue? So we have a new character. We have Mama, who is the narrator's mother. Learning a little bit about her, what does she do? Well, she carries her pot with her cooked beans, and it's full of nicks and dents, and she got it at the Salvation Army, right? So we're picturing this old galvanized pot, right? And it's covered, and she's carrying it out of the house. All right, so it gives us a little bit of an idea of what Mama is about, okay, and how we could describe her if we needed to. We notice that at that point, Roberto opens the door quickly for her, and Papa gently places that pot into the car. So that tells us a little bit about how they feel based on their actions towards Mama and the interaction, how they feel about Mama, right? How they look to her. Okay, so just a thought on that. And so that helps develop their characters a little bit more. Mr. Sullivan, the tall, husky man, he is the one that lives in the big white house with the fence and the roses. And what can we determine from that, right? They describe his house as, you have to walk up the stairs to get to the house. So we can see that Mr. Sullivan may be a little bit wealthy, right? Maybe the one that owns the farm, right? That may have all the wealth. And so that's how they chose to describe him. So when we're talking about setting, okay, and we're talking about the setting here, that setting then helps to determine that, right? By like paying attention to what they're saying about where she's walking when she's going to meet Mr. Sullivan. Something about Papa, one thing he had mentioned, and I put this in a quote, Mama, you and the little ones sleep on the mattress. Roberto, Panchito, and I will sleep outside under the trees. So what do we learn just from what Papa had said there? It's one of the last lines of that particular page. Well, we know that the name of the narrator is Panchito. Okay, we caught that from what he said. We know that there are younger siblings, and that those younger siblings are going to be sleeping with Mama, while the father, Papa, will sleep outside with the boys. So the males will be sleeping outside. There's no bed for them. So what does that tell you also about the setting? And just a little bit about the characters and, how they live, right? So you can start to assign character traits for some of these characters based on these interactions that they are having with each other and what we're seeing in the writing, in the story. Now, the setting, the labor camp in Fresno, right? We know that they're living in this garage on the camp, right? No windows. It's a one-room garage. Dirt floors, there's lots of worms around. They described it as like as a roadmap. So that's a metaphor. And so holes in the walls and kerosene lantern. So the question is, as we're developing the character, something else as part of the exposition that's really important is the setting. How does the setting affect the characters and the mood, okay, of the story? So how is the setting contributing to that? So you need to be thinking about that too as the story starts to move on and progress. Early the next morning, Mr. Sullivan showed us where his crop was, and after breakfast, Papa, Roberto, and I headed for the vineyard to pick. Around 9 o'clock, the temperature had risen to almost 100 degrees. I was completely soaked in sweat, and my mouth felt as if I'd been chewing on a handkerchief. I walked over to the end of the row, picked up the jug of water we had brought, and began drinking. Don't drink too much, you'll get sick, Roberto shouted. No sooner had he said that than I felt sick to my stomach. I dropped to my knees and let the jug roll off my hands. I remained motionless with my eyes glued on the hot, sandy ground. All I could hear was the drone of insects. Slowly I began to recover. I poured water over my face and neck and watched the dirty water run down my arms to the ground. I still felt dizzy when we took a break to eat lunch. It was past 2 o'clock and we sat underneath a large walnut tree that was on the side of the road. While we ate, Papa jotted down the number of boxes we had picked. Roberto drew designs on the ground with a stick. Suddenly I noticed Papa's face turn pale as he looked down the road. "Here comes the school bus," he whispered loudly, in alarm. Instinctively, Roberto and I ran and hid in the vineyards. We did not want to get in trouble for not going to school. The neatly dressed boys about my age got off. They carried books under their arms. After they crossed the street, the bus drove away. Roberto and I came out from hiding and joined Papa. After lunch, we went back to work. The sun kept beating down. The buzzing insects, the wet sweat, and the hot, dry dust made the afternoon seem to last forever. Finally, the mountains around the valley reached out and swallowed the sun. Wow, listen to that personification. Within an hour, it was too dark to continue picking. The vines blanketed the grapes, making it difficult to see the bunches. "Vámonos," said Papa, signaling to us that it was time to quit work. Papa then took out a pencil and began to figure out how much we had earned our first day. He wrote down numbers, crossed some out, wrote down some more. "15," he murmured. Well, so we're back to our slide and our setting. I'm going to start there in the top right corner. It is 100 degrees. That's pretty hot, guys. And they're in a vineyard, so now we know that they are in California working in a vineyard where they grow grapes, right? And they're picking the grapes. We have buzzing insects flying around, and they have hot, dry dust, and they're out in the sun, and they're picking these grapes. So think of the setting, right? So what's happening there? And we can see the reaction of the characters, right, with Panchito. And we can describe him in this part of the story as working and really feeling how hard and how difficult it is. So his mouth is feeling as if he's chewing on a handkerchief, right? A little bit of a simile there. Soaked in sweat, sick to stomach, right? Dizzy. And so the setting is really creating a conflict with Panchito here, right? Because the effects of the environment around him are making him feel sick. All right, so when we're talking about setting and we talk about the importance of it, it is very important, okay, because it can really contribute to conflict. Papa, we notice he is counting now. If we're trying to do some more character development and we're thinking like looking at these characters carefully, he's counting the number of boxes that they picked. He's counting those very carefully, right? Why do you think that he is counting those boxes? It's so hard to do this and not have you right in front of me, because I know your hands would be raised right now, and I know you're thinking about this, right? Also, his face is turned pale, right, when he saw the school bus. Now, that's interesting. What was with the school bus? Why did Panchito and Roberto run from the school bus? Another reason or way in which this setting can create conflict. Conflict is a problem, and there's a problem there, right? There's a problem there. They would not be running away from the school bus had there not been a problem. So that's something to think about, okay, and to ponder on, all right, as we continue the story, that they would feel the need, that they would have to do that. And what do we know about those characters if they feel that they need to do that? Okay, why aren't they in school? Why aren't they going to school like the other kids? Okay, so we're going to move on and read some more. When we arrived home, we took a cold shower underneath a water hose. We then sat down to eat dinner around some wooden crates that served as a table. Mama had cooked a special meal for us. We had rice and tortillas with carne con chile, my favorite dish. The next morning, I could hardly move. My body ached all over. I felt little control over my arms and legs. The feeling went on every morning for days until my muscles finally got used to the work. It was Monday, the first week of November. The grape season was over, and I could now go to school. I woke up early that morning and lay in bed, looking at the stars and savoring the thought of not going to work and of starting sixth grade for the first time that year. Since I could not sleep, I decided to get up and join Papa and Roberto at breakfast. I sat at the table across from Roberto, but I kept my head down. I did not want to look up and face him. I knew he was sad. He was not going to school today. He was not going tomorrow, or next week, or next month. He would not go until the cotton season was over, and that was sometime in February. I rubbed my hands together and watched the dry, acid-stained skin fall to the floor in little rolls. When Papa and Roberto left for work, I felt relief. I walked to the top of a small grade next to the shack and watched the Carsachita disappear in the distance in a cloud of dust. 2 hours later, around 8 o'clock, I stood by the side of the road waiting for school bus number 20. When it arrived, I climbed in. Everyone was busy, either talking or yelling. I sat in an empty seat in the back. When the bus stopped in front of the school, I felt very nervous. I looked out the bus window and saw boys and girls carrying books under their arms. I put my hands in my pant pockets and walked to the principal's office. When I entered, I heard a woman's voice say, "May I help you?" I was startled. I had not heard English for months. For a few seconds, I remained speechless. I looked at the lady who waited for an answer. My first instinct was to answer her in Spanish, but I held back. Finally, after struggling for English words, I managed to tell her that I wanted to enroll in the sixth grade. After answering many questions, I was led to the classroom. In that section, things to think about. Roberto is sad that he cannot go to school. Panchito knows this and he keeps his head down at breakfast. When we talk about character development and how we can describe characters in a story, their actions are important. What could you say about Panchito due to his action in that time at breakfast? So be thinking about that. How many of you have ever had to enroll yourself into school, right? Did your parents do it? Why do you think that the narrator did not have his parents do it? Why do you think Panchito enrolled himself in school? Something else to think about. And how is this new setting, the bus and the school, contributing to a possible conflict? So you can see this is a little conflictive with him. Okay, so how is that contributing? Mr. Lima, the sixth grade teacher, greeted me and assigned me a desk. He then introduced me to the class. I was so nervous and scared at that moment when everyone's eyes were on me that I wished I were with Papa and Roberto picking cotton. After taking roll, Mr. Lima gave the class the assignment for the first hour. "The first thing we have to do this morning is finish reading the story we began yesterday," he said enthusiastically. He walked up to me, handed me an English book, and asked me to read. "We are on page 125, he said politely. When I heard this, I felt my blood rush to my head. I felt dizzy. "Would you like to read?" he asked hesitantly. I opened the book to page 125. My mouth was dry. My eyes began to water. I could not begin. "You can read later," Mr. Lima said, understandingly. During recess, I went into the restroom and opened my English book to page 125. I began to read in a low voice, pretending I was in class. There were many words I did not know. I closed the book and headed back to the classroom. Mr. Lima was sitting at his desk correcting papers. When I entered, he looked up at me and smiled. I felt better. I walked up to him and asked if he could help me with the new words. "Gladly," he said. The rest of the month, I spent my lunch hours working on English with Mr. Lima, my best friend at school. One Friday during lunch hour, Mr. Lima asked me to take a walk with him to the music room. "Do you like music?" he asked me as we entered the building. "Yes, I like corridos," I answered. He then picked up a trumpet, blew on it, and handed it to me. The sound gave me goosebumps. I knew that sound. I had heard it in many corridos. How would you like to learn how to play it? He asked. He must have read my face, because before I could answer, he added, I'll teach you how to play it during our lunch hours. That day, I could hardly wait to tell Papa and Mama the great news. As I got off the bus, my little brothers and sister ran up to meet me. They were yelling and screaming. I thought they were happy to see me, but when I opened the door to our shack, I saw that everything we owned was neatly packed in cardboard boxes. Conflict, when we talk about conflict, we're talking about problems within the story. So evidence of conflict that we see with Panchito obviously is the language barriers. We see that with the parents as well. We saw that when Mama had to speak to Mr. Sullivan. We saw that when Panchito had to go into the school and enroll himself into school. We're seeing it now when he is trying to read from the English book and he is unable to do that. So there is a language barrier there, right? And there is also, if we go back to the minor conflict of Roberto not being able to go to school with the changing of the crops, moving from strawberries to cotton, Roberto is unable to go back to school, but now Panchito, being the younger brother, that is kind of the traditional thing, he is able to go and Roberto is not. And we know how Panchito put his head down. He was embarrassed about that, or felt sad for Roberto and didn't want to look Roberto in the eye. So these minor conflicts that are occurring here, minor problems, these external problems, those all feed into one major problem, right? The main conflict. And the main conflict is that they move around too much. They have a job, the migrant workers have a job where they're unable to stay in one place for a long period of time, and Panchito's unable to learn what he needs to learn in order to feel more comfortable. That's external. Everything is external, right? These are external issues, but the internal issue, you could say that Panchito has some internal conflicts within himself because, you know, he has feelings there that are uncomfortable and that are sad, and he feels like one of the things he needs to do is to go to Mr. Lima and ask Mr. Lima for help, which we know that he does. Continuing character development, you have Panchito in instead of going to the recess yard, going into the restroom and practicing his reading. What does that tell you about his character, Panchito's character? What's important to him, right? And Mr. Lima says, you can read later, understandingly. Okay, so here we have Mr. Lima being very understanding about this, okay? And what does that tell you about his character? So as we continue on to the story, you don't stop paying attention to the fact that these characters are doing things, they are saying things that are helping us to develop their character better. So the climax is what we know to be the high point of the story, right? So where do we see that there was a change in the story or something really important that happened? And normally if we were in the classroom, we would be discussing this, you would be talking to each other about it. So think about that for just a second. If you thought about the point where he is in the restroom and he is unable to read the English book, and he leaves the restroom and he goes back into the classroom and he decides to ask Mr. Lima for help, that really was the climatic moment in this short story. I put the quote in there. He looked at me and smiled, right? He didn't look at him in disgust. Why aren't you out in the recess yard? Quit bothering me, kid, right? No, he looked at him and smiled. I asked him if he would help me with new words. Gladly, he said. Did this with, just the utmost, of course I will, right? So that gives us a lot of information again about Mr. Lima's character. In his words, in his dialogue, we can then develop further Mr. Lima's character. We can give him more character traits. We can have a discussion about what he truly is about, right? And how he built this relationship with Panchito. Panchito, right? How has his character changed based on his interactions with Mr. Lima, right? The rest of the month, here we go. This goes like into the falling action. If that was the climatic moment when he asks Mr. Lima for help, Mr. Lima's giving him help. Those are the actions in the falling action. So the rest of the month, I spent my lunch hours working on English with Mr. Lima, my best friend at school. So think about Panchito now. He has developed a friendship, a relationship with Mr. Lima, and he is saying in his dialogue that things are better, right? He is spending every day and he is now working with him. And Mr. Lima is not just teaching him English, but able to give him a little bit of something that he probably was starving for, and that is some of the arts, right? The music, the trumpet playing. So the relationship between the two have really helped to resolve a little bit of Panchito's, when we talk about conflict within himself and his barriers, that relationship helped to resolve some of that, right? And how brave it was for Panchito to seek out that help, right? He almost just had enough. And so those are all very important in the story. I just want to go back to the plot diagram that we went over in the beginning. And this one is now complete. So now that we have read the full story of the circuit, remember, this is a short story. This is not like a whole novel. So we were able to fill this out in a short amount of time. It's not that much time. Your novel's going to take a lot longer. If you look to the right, I even wrote some of that in the margin there, but you can see I filled in the exposition with the characters, and we did some rising action. The four main parts of the novel that I felt were important to include with a novel that you're going to be reading. There's going to be a lot more events in there because it's a longer stretch of time and a longer piece of literature. But this one being a short story, I chose four major events that happened, right? Realize it's time to move on to the next camp. The season is changing, the preparation for that, the new camp arriving with Mr. Sullivan, and then the ability for him to be able to go to school, and he's uncomfortable. And so that was my fourth event. And then you can see that my climax up there is when he asks Mr. Lima for help, and Mr. Lima gladly says that he will. You've got the falling action of the meeting at lunch, and then the resolution. Now, the resolution for this is that Panchito feels happy and excited to be in school. This is a chapter book. And as we know, the main conflict, which we have down in the bottom right corner, if you look at the conflicts there, I've kind of listed them. The main conflict is really his inability to stay in one place, right? His family moves all the time as the seasons change. We know that conflict was not resolved. So think about the ending of the book, which anytime I read this book out loud to the kids, to, any of my classes, I get the same reaction at the end of the book, where it's almost like this, oh, really? Like, did that just happen? Because we know Panchito came home and he's so excited about all of his time he's spending with Mr. Lima and all the time that all the things that he's learning, and he's getting caught up on his English, and he's just feeling good about himself. And then he gets home and he realizes that all the boxes are packed again. All of his belongings are packed neatly in cardboard boxes. And that's how the story ends, right? That mini story, that's how it ends. So we know that this conflict is truly not resolved. He isn't actually, he's actually leaving again. And he's actually moving on to another place, which is going to start his main conflict all over again. But for a short while, Mr. Lima was able to help him and provide some resolution to the issues that he was having. So just remember, this was a short story. Your novel will be longer, your plot will expand, and you will not have a climax or resolution until the very end of the novel. So wow, that was a long lesson, about 40 minutes, right? Just about the time it takes in the classroom. But I thought that it would be important for you to hear a read aloud if you had the time to do it. I hope that you did. So we were able to go over some of the things that we would talk about in class, and this should help you to apply with your own book, right? So with your own book that you are reading, think about how the character and the setting are extremely important in the story. When you read a book, look closely at the characters, the interactions that they are having with others, their behaviors, their dialogue, to help you to develop character traits and see character change within the novel. Think about the setting of the story, how important it is, and how it contributes to the conflict. And then work hard on really picking out important parts for your rising action in your plot, determining what that climax high point moment is, and the falling action and resolution. All of those will fall towards the end of the novel. Whew, that's a lot, right? So thank you for taking the time to listen to the story and go through this with me. I hope that you enjoyed it. I really do enjoy those short stories from the Circuit book. That book is in the library. Mrs. Massey has a copy of it if any of you are interested next year, or if you want to pick it up in your local library over this summer. Have a great day.